The Great Basin Desert in Nevada is usually teeming with life. For decades, the black-tailed jackrabbit has been the heartbeat of this dry landscape. They are the bottom of the food chain, the engine that keeps everything else alive. But recently, the desert suddenly went quiet. A senior wildlife biologist named Thomas noticed a complete absence of tracks during a routine field survey. No fresh burrows, no signs of grazing, and strangely, no carcasses. Entire colonies were just gone. At first, researchers assumed it was a standard population dip caused by a harsh winter or a localized disease, but the data from across the state painted a much darker picture. The rabbits weren't just declining, they were being completely erased. In a normal ecological collapse, when the prey vanishes, the predators starve. But local rangers noted something deeply unsettling. Coyote and eagle populations weren't dropping at all. The natural predators were eating exactly as much as they always did. If the local wildlife wasn't causing the collapse, what was? To find out, Thomas and his team set up a grid of thermal cameras in a remote stretch of the high desert. They expected to document a spreading sickness or an invasive predator. Instead, the night footage revealed a completely different kind of threat. Something was quietly harvesting the desert in the dark. Thomas sat in his truck, staring at the glowing monitor in total silence. The thermal video from the previous night was playing on a relentless loop. At 2:14 a.m., a single jackrabbit appeared on the screen, grazing near a patch of sagebrush. Then, the ground directly beneath it seemed to shift. A long, slender heat signature slid out of a nearby burrow. A second one emerged instantly, then a third. They didn't stalk the rabbit like a coyote or a bobcat would. They simply swarmed it. In less than 10 seconds, the rabbit was dragged straight down into the earth. There was no chase, no scattered remains on the surface, just a swift, brutal extraction into the dark. Thomas immediately forwarded the raw file to David, a veteran wildlife tracker based in Reno. David had spent 30 years mapping predator behaviors across the Great Basin. When he finally called Thomas back, his voice was visibly tight. The movement patterns didn't match any native species on record. The signatures were too long, too low to the ground, and moving with an unnatural level of coordination. Worse, they were using the jackrabbit's own underground tunnel systems against them. By dawn, Thomas and David were hiking into the camera zone. They needed physical evidence. A track, a tuft of fur, a dropping, anything to identify the invaders. But the desert floor was completely undisturbed. There was no blood and no sign of a struggle. Just an eerie, overpowering smell hanging in the dry morning air. It was a sharp, musky scent, almost metallic. David knelt in the dirt and began digging into the entrance of the primary burrow. He reached shoulder deep into the dark soil. His fingers brushed against something cold and strangely textured. He pulled it out into the harsh sunlight. It wasn't a rabbit, and it absolutely did not belong in this desert. David held up a long, translucent strip of shed skin. It was thick, heavily scaled, and easily 5 feet long. Thomas recognized it immediately, but his brain refused to accept the reality. This wasn't a rattlesnake or a native gopher snake. The scale patterns and sheer girth pointed to something entirely different, an apex predator from the other side of the world. They bagged the sample and drove straight to the State Wildlife Laboratory in Reno. Marcus, the lead regional herpetologist, spread the skin across a stainless steel examination table. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his expression was entirely grim. The shed belonged to a Burmese python. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. Pythons are strictly tropical animals. They require intense humidity and constant heat to survive. The Nevada desert nights frequently drop well below freezing, meaning any python dumped out here should have died in a matter of days. But the thermal footage proved they weren't just surviving. They were thriving and systematically stripping the ecosystem bare. Marcus walked over to a geologic map of the Great Basin. He traced a red marker along a specific valley where the rabbits had vanished. This wasn't just a random stretch of barren sand. It sat directly above an abandoned geothermal energy grid built in the late 1980s. Miles of deep, naturally heated pipes were still buried beneath the soil. The snakes hadn't just invaded the desert. They had discovered a massive, artificially heated underground fortress. To find out exactly how many were down there, the team needed to see inside the network. The next morning, Thomas and David returned with a subterranean fiber optic camera. They fed the glowing cable deep into the main burrow. As the monitor flickered to life, They realized exactly what had replaced the rabbits. The camera feed plunged 30 feet below the desert floor. The narrow dirt tunnel suddenly opened into a massive concrete cavern. It was a forgotten junction box for the old geothermal grid. David adjusted the thermal contrast on the small monitor. The concrete floor wasn't gray. It was moving. A thick, writhing mass of scales covered every inch of the subterranean chamber. Dozens of adult pythons were coiled tightly around the rusted thermal pipes, soaking in the extreme heat. Thomas felt a cold sweat break across his neck. This wasn't a small handful of dumped pets. It was a highly established, aggressively reproducing colony. But as the camera panned across the tangled bodies, the biological reality of the situation became truly unsettling. Burmese pythons are strictly solitary animals. They do not share territory in the wild. Yet down in this dark, heated bunker, survival had forced a brutal behavioral adaptation. They were denning together to consolidate warmth. In the far corner of the chamber, David spotted a massive pile of discarded bones. He zoomed the lens in, analyzing the remains in the dim light. There were hundreds of fragile jackrabbit skulls, piled like gravel. But jutting out from the center of the bone pile was something entirely different. A skull that was far too large to belong to a rodent. Thick jawbone, sharp, pronounced canines. Thomas leaned closer to the screen, his breathing suddenly stopped. It was the skull of a full-grown coyote. The rabbits hadn't just been a food source, they were bait. The snakes were completely clearing out the bottom of the food chain, forcing the starving desert predators to hunt near the burrows. Then, the camera feed violently shook. A massive, thick shadow suddenly blocked out the light. Something at the bottom of the pit had just noticed that heavy fiber optic cable ripped violently through David's thick leather gloves. He shouted, planting his boots into the dirt as the cord was pulled straight down into the earth. Whatever had grabbed the camera wasn't just striking it, it was anchoring it. The small monitor mounted on the truck flashed with violent static before snapping entirely black. Thomas grabbed the cable to help, but the tension suddenly went dead slack. When they hauled the line back to the surface, the titanium camera housing was completely crushed. Deep, jagged scoring marks cut through the industrial metal. A normal python strikes, bites, and coils to suffocate. They do not possess the localized jaw strength to shatter solid titanium. Thomas stared at the mangled metal, a cold realization settling in his chest. These weren't just displaced pets struggling to survive. Generations of extreme isolation had forced rapid, unnatural adaptations. Breeding
shows the
animals far
entire
larger
regional
and more
geothermal
aggressive
grid.
than anything recorded
They're using
in
the
wild.
tunnels.
They
They're
urgently
everywhere.
needed to know how far this underground network stretched. They drove straight to the county
Look at
records
this right
office,
here.
demanding the
These lines
original
go on for
blueprints for the
miles.
defunct 1980s
This whole grid
geothermal
is
project.
connected.
An older structural
We have
engineer
no idea
named
how far
Arthur
these tunnels
unrolled
go.
the yellowed schematics across a large drafting table. He traced the main heated pipeline out from the desert junction box. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as Arthur's finger moved across the map. The grid didn't just loop through the
goes
barren
right under
wilderness.
the suburbs.
The primary thermal artery
Quickly on top of
extended
the
8
artery.
miles
And here,
eastward,
phase
carrying
2 is
trapped
right on the
heat
line.
directly
They built a
beneath the
whole
county's
neighborhood on it.
largest agricultural reservoir, and right under the concrete foundation of a rural housing development. Arthur looked
It
up
was
from the
permanently
blueprints, his
engaged.
face grim. The heat
They
pump on
couldn't
that eastern
bypass
sector
it.
never actually shut down, he warned softly. Thomas realized the horrifying truth. The barren desert cavern wasn't the main colony. It was just a hunting ground.
They're in
The
position
team
now.
immediately contacted
fast, we're
state
timed.
wildlife enforcement. Within
Stay on the
24
grass.
hours, a specialized extraction unit arrived quietly at the rural subdivision. They brought military-grade ground-penetrating thermal radar. Directly beneath the local park, the thermal mass was staggering. Hundreds of intersecting heat signatures were tightly packed around the active, vibrating pump station. The pythons hadn't just survived
these
the brutal
tracks
Nevada
here.
winter. They had claimed a forgotten human infrastructure as a permanent, climate-controlled breeding facility. State officials quietly initiated a massive eradication protocol, desperate to avoid a localized panic. Heavy machinery sealed off the primary subterranean vent. Exterminators pumped lethal, odorless gas deep into the miles of concrete artery. For weeks, Thomas and David monitored the desert perimeter. The thermal
There is
cameras
nothing
went
left.
entirely dark. The surface felt perfectly still. But a haunting question remained. Burmese pythons can hold their breath for up to 30 minutes, and a massive network of unmapped drainage pipes still connects directly to the
Official
reservoir.
declaration,
The state
neutralized.
officially declared the invasive colony neutralized. Yet, local rangers report that
There's
the
nothing.
jackrabbits have never returned to that
No
stretch of
rabbits,
the
no
high
rodents,
desert.
not even
It
a
is a
single
chilling
lizard.
reminder of human oversight. We build sprawling underground networks, abandon them, and assume they will simply decay. But nature is relentlessly opportunistic. When we leave our concrete ruins behind, we have no idea what might move in to replace us. If you want to uncover
They're
more
already
hidden
listening.
ecological mysteries, tap
We're
the
out of
subscribe
time.
button, and I'll see you in the next investigation.